Welcome to Chapter 12, Lecture 12, Kinesiology 158, Motor Learning and Control. This is the last chapter of the term. This is a chapter all about feedback. Let's get to it. In this chapter, we'll discuss, obviously, what feedback is. There's definitely different ways to classify it, different types. Really going to pick apart, as you'd imagine, as most of this semester has gotten to, how do we best utilize feedback, understanding the various forms and ways to deliver it. How do we utilize it to best lead to motor skill performance? How do we provide the best feedback for people to learn the best? And that's kind of a common theme throughout this book, right? And throughout the class. So we can classify feedback in multiple ways. So sensory feedback is very much information that we receive on our own, receive directly from our sensory systems, right? You are, trying to shoot a basket, you see the ball go in the basket, feedback is it was a successful trial. That's as simple as sensory feedback is. There's obviously multiple examples of that. There is also proprioceptive feedback, and so less so external, but more internal to our body. So if you're doing a skill that involves body positioning, some sort of resulting body position that you end up in or are able to do would also be that feedback. So it's almost more of a kinesthetic type of body movement sort of thing that you internally need to be aware of. There's also exteroceptive feedback, which are related to things in your environment. So the changes in the environment that might provide you with that feedback, they're out there as well. Augmented feedback is provided by someone else besides the performer. So provided by a source external to the performer, coaches, trainers, clinicians, teachers, parents, friends, you name it. Usually another human being. Can be a machine, I guess, but machines don't quite have the ability to make decisions associated with feedback quite as well, or at least not yet. So there's both verbal and non-verbal feedback, augmented feedback that can be provided. The classification of that feedback kind of falls into two main categories: knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. Knowledge of results is exactly that. Yep, you made the basket. Knowledge of performance is more about, your form in the process of shooting the basket, right? Your performance wasn't so good. Don't care so much about the outcome. So there is a difference between those types of feedback, right? Hey, it was a successful trial. Don't really care how you got there, or the process of doing the skill was or was not optimal. So within those categories as well, we can address things like concurrent feedback or terminal feedback. So concurrent feedback is feedback that's given while the performer is performing, right? And I think that star tracing task, if you guys have done that lab, if you did that lab this semester, that would be an example of concurrent feedback. While you're performing the skill, the task, you're getting feedback from the machine either buzzing at you or the lights turning on. There's also, and so terminal feedback would be that feedback provided afterwards. Distinct feedback or accumulated feedback. Distinct feedback is feedback given after a specific trial or a specific attempt. All right, each time I shoot a free throw, I'm going to get some feedback on it. Whereas accumulated feedback is, do a whole bunch of free throws, and then I'll give you some ideas and feedback specifically with that group of attempts that you just did. So that's distinct versus augmented. Sort of a family tree style demonstration, right, of the classification of feedback. We have sensory on the left and augmented on the right. Be familiar with this tree and at least the relationships of those factors. There's no doubt. That's from the book. So what's the purpose, right? What are the functions of augmented feedback? And we can really break it down into four main areas. First, just the information, right? Augmented feedback provides information to the learner and for them to then process and use that information to better their performance. That's an essential function of feedback. So yes, it gives a source of interpretable information, knowledge of results. So knowledge of results is important, right? But there can be a certain level of redundancy with knowledge of results and sensory feedback, and you could probably come up with multiple examples. Um, but yeah, when you have sensory feedback and you know that your result was not a positive one, and then you get feedback that also says it, it can be redundant. Maybe in baseball, right? Swinging and missing at a pitch, you know that's a strike, but then the umpire telling you it's a strike, it's like, I didn't need that feedback, right? Even though that's his job or her job. So knowledge of results in the sense of information isn't always that beneficial. The knowledge of performance can be a little bit more beneficial, right? How did I perform, and what are the causes of that result? It'd be important. Maybe the ump, instead of after you swing and miss, the ump can go, you started to swing a little bit early, or your shoulder dropped a little bit too soon. That would be, helping get to the cause of the poor performance. So the knowledge of performance is a little bit more useful on the informational side. Ultimately, So looking at the correct and incorrect action outcomes and movement patterns, do you think learners would want information about successful trials and feedback or unsuccessful trials, right? So successes versus errors. The most effective information, and it's already in the bold there, so I'm not even going to give you time to think about it, but information concerning errors is most effective when it comes to feedback. So, hey, I just swung the bat and hit a home run. You don't need to give me any feedback. I know I did something right, so I'm going to just keep doing that. Versus when I feedback about when I swing and miss, that feedback about the error is much more beneficial. All right, the motivational function of augmented feedback. So getting feedback does provide a certain level of motivation to the learner if the feedback's presented in the right way. So, messages of improvement versus non-improvement. What do you think leads to better learning? So do you want to hear as a learner that you're getting better or that you're not getting better? Take a second. So messages of improvement by far lead to better outcomes. It does increase motivation. So hearing that you're doing better is motivational. Oh, hey, really? I'm starting to get better at whatever, swinging the bat? That's great. I need to hear that because I can't really tell, and that feedback is really important. Conversely, hearing that you are getting worse or that you keep failing can be demoralizing. It can decrease motivation, and you all know the effects of motivation on learning, so we don't want to mess with that. So do things to improve motivation, provide that messages of improvement, not so much non-improvement. The third function is a reinforcing function. And so by reinforcement, any change in surroundings that occur regularly as a result of a certain behavior. And so there's different ways to sort of use feedback to reinforce that certain behavior. And so the law of effect is one of them. And the law of effect, basically described by Thorndike, is a tendency to repeat behaviors with desirable consequences. And so if you get feedback about doing things right, that effect will lead to you wanting to do it more often. Things like positive reinforcement, getting messages about, yeah, you're doing great, keep it up. That doesn't have anything to do with knowledge of performance or knowledge of results. It's just positive reinforcement, and you should know these. There's definitely a quiz or exam question on this. Punishment. Yeah, you don't hit the ball this next swing, give me 10 push-ups, right? That's punishment. Punishment is a form of feedback. Negative reinforcement is defined as the removal of punishment, which is ultimately a positive thing, I think, right? Two negatives make a positive. It is kind of that situation. A strategy to maximize this reinforcing function is to sandwich these techniques. And the idea is to provide some positive reinforcement, then either with a punishment or some sort of negative feedback, and then sandwich it with another positive reinforcement. So, hey, that was fantastic. You just did something great. And then, work on this. And then the next one is, oh, that was great. And so it's sort of this sandwich of effect. You don't want to give too much negative feedback because that will decrease motivation, remember. So that sandwich technique is pretty effective. And then lastly, we have the guidance function. So one of the features or functions of feedback is to guide learners to their correct actions. So I'm going to give you feedback to literally help you through this process. I'm going to pretty much hug you from behind and do the golf swing with you, right? And while you're doing the golf swing, I'm going to be guiding you through the process. That would be a form of feedback. It keeps learners performing within that prescribed range of performance, right? You're really helping them, giving them that feedback. The prevailing opinion, and there isn't, research is sort of out there on this, but is that there tends to be a helicopter type of effect with this sort of feedback. And by helicopter, and some of you may have heard the term like helicopter parent, where when too much feedback, too much guidance is given, the performer can't perform on their own. All of a sudden, that guidance feature of feedback is gone, and the individual doesn't know what to do because they're not getting that feedback anymore. So the guidance function, if overutilized, can have a negative outcome. So let's talk about feedback in terms of the precision, the timing, and the frequency. So what are the optimum amounts of all three of these things? Let's talk about precision first. And so in terms of precision of feedback, we can give it qualitatively or quantitatively. Qualitative is sort of that vagueness, right? Hey, you were close. All right, good job. You're a little bit to the left. Slow down a bit, right? Those are qualitative types of feedback. The problem with those is that's just not enough information, and learners don't necessarily know how much to adjust. And you might have done that beanbag toss lab, which we've already mentioned in the lectures, right, where you are getting qualitative and quantitative feedback. Hey, you were short. Hey, you're left. Doesn't give enough, right? Where quantitative, the direction and magnitude of feedback is provided. So, oh, you're to the left a little bit, maybe by a foot. Or, slow down, maybe, about a quarter of the speed that you're doing now. Some sort of tangible idea about the magnitude and direction of that error. The limitation of these types of feedback is really up to the interpretation of the learner. And certain learners do great with a high level of precision, and some don't. And so really there isn't a perfect way to know how your learner is going to respond, but know that there is going to be, again, sort of a sweet spot. What this graph from your text shows is, there is sort of this curvilinear relationship that on the x-axis, right, we have this precision of feedback getting from less precise or qualitative to very precise and quantitative. Not enough information retention isn't good, not enough feedback. But then also there's a sweet spot, and it's in the quantitative realm. We need to get something tangible. But then if too much feedback in that world is also that curve will start to drop back down. This has been researched. You may have done a feedback lab for this class. I know there's one potentially in the books. At the time of this recording, I'm not 100% sure if it was added or not. But Rogers in 1974 did a research study that investigated the optimum level of feedback gain, for example, precision for any specific task. And so one of the tasks that they looked at was a visual timing task. And it was a tapping task where light went on basically, or it was a timing where they had to do the row of lights where you had to do the timing. And the precision was given in digits. So it was timed, like how many seconds were you off? They gave 1 digit, 4, or 8 digits of information. And so the results identified that sweet spot, right? And so the digits of feedback, if you look down here in the table, when only 1 digit of feedback was given, right? And so this is in seconds, so you were off by a second. Versus 4 digits, you're off by 1.001 seconds. 8 digits, you're off by 1.0010011. That's 8. Too much feedback, right? And so what their research demonstrated was that, there was a sweet spot. 1 and 8 digits of feedback. 1 wasn't enough. 8 was too many. And so the error, right, and this is measuring error, so the lower the number, the better. The error remained higher for the 1 and 8 digit feedback, whereas the 4 digit feedback seemed to be just enough, right? Just the right amount. So precision of feedback. So the knowledge of results and knowledge of performance, um, the application of them, right? And so knowledge of results, we're just providing outcome of a performance attempt. Knowledge of performance, we're identifying specific errors, and it can be more useful in the precision of feedback. And so within the knowledge of performance, we can provide descriptive feedback, which describes the error. Hey, let's describe what you did wrong so you have a better understanding of what you did wrong. And then there's prescriptive feedback, which prescribes a correction. Look, that was a poor attempt, so do this next time, right? That would be prescriptive. Like, okay, better backswing or do more of a backswing next time. Whereas descriptive would be like, you didn't do enough of a backswing. So it's kind of a negative versus positive approach, kind of saying the same thing just in a different way. The McGill and Wood did a study. There isn't much talked about in your text, but at least it is mentioned. It talks about this level of feedback in early learning. And so the less precise the feedback that is given, the better it is for early learners. The better learners get, the greater precision of feedback they can handle. So be mindful of that effect. All right, timing of feedback. When do we provide it? And how often do we provide it? So, learners, and we all have, not just learners, we're all learners, we have a limited attention span, right? So if we provide too much feedback, at least at too high of an interval, it may use up our attention, and all of a sudden we're just paying attention to the feedback instead of the task at hand. And so, so the temporal interval, so the timing of feedback has been investigated quite a bit. Knowledge of results delay interval, which is basically the performance, and then how long do you wait to give the knowledge of results. And then the post-knowledge of results delay interval, which is, okay, you got your knowledge of results, and now how much longer are you going to wait to actually do the next task, have been looked at, as have the inter-response interval. So how long is it from one trial to the next? It's a long description for me to pretty much come up to the conclusion that, yes, there needs to be, at least with all tasks, right? There isn't any absolute perfect amount of time to wait. And so this temporal interval idea is something to be considered. But with all tasks, there needs to be at least a considerable amount of time allowed to process the trial that was just done. So immediate feedback, so the KR delay interval, right? You do a trial, and then as soon as you're literally done with the backswing, you get that immediate feedback. You're like, oh, well, wait a sec. I didn't get to process what I just did on my own first. And so the KR delay interval, there needs to be a KR delay interval. How long it is specifically depends on the complexity of the task, depends on the learner themselves. But the KR delay interval, you need to have time after performing to at least process what you just did and almost give a self-evaluation, which we do subconsciously quite often, right? So the ultimate is that, yeah, there a few seconds at the least needs to be allowed for the KR delay interval and even the post-KR delay interval. So get that feedback from someone and don't just immediately get the feedback and do the trial again. Allow yourself, the learner should, then take some time to take in that feedback and then allow a few seconds for processing and then utilize it. So there is a sweet spot. I think the author provides you a nice handy little curvilinear graph that says, yeah, there is an optimum amount of time between them, but really it's impossible to identify in a big picture sense because it is such an individually sort of based phenomenon, and that time will vary for every task and every learner. So finally, let's talk about frequency of feedback. So how often should we give feedback? Should we give it every trial? Should we give it every 20 trials? So the first idea is that, yeah, frequent feedback does promote practice performance. So during practice, feedback is important, and the more you give it, typically the better. Learning outcomes, though, aren't necessarily always the same, and so too much feedback can be too much feedback. So the absolute and relative frequency of feedback have been looked at. So absolute is, exactly how much feedback are you giving for a certain number of trials, and relative is usually looked at as a percent. I'm going to give feedback to you every 50% of your trials. And so the relationship, as you can imagine, is curvilinear, right? There is sort of that optimum sort of sweet spot. And so when we look at the relative frequency of feedback, and that's that sort of looking at it as percent, in this case, that 40 to 60% zone is, that's the best retention there. You don't want to give it every trial. It's too much. But if you give it once every 10 trials, that might not be enough. And so the optimum amount of feedback, at least when it comes to learning, looks to be into that, that 40 to 60% zone. The guidance hypothesis. So the idea, and we talked a little bit about guidance before, why is high relative frequency of feedback less beneficial to learning? So why is it that when we get to the 80 to 90 to 100% feedback ratio, why can that be detrimental or not as beneficial to learning? And so one of the ideas is that, that high level of feedback, it becomes part of the task being learned. And so the learners start to depend on that feedback in order to perform again. Kind of like that whole helicopter parent thing or the helicopter teacher thing where you can't perform without that guidance anymore. And so occasionally it can lead to sort of maladaptive short-term corrections. Too much feedback, you start to overthink and overanalyze and over-adjust when that maybe isn't necessary. And even some research says, it may block other important processing functions. So that ability to auto-detect your own errors and auto-correct those own errors is sometimes lost in that process. And so be mindful as a teacher, coach, clinician, whatever you are going to be, right? To not give too much feedback, right? And sometimes as a motivated teacher, it's hard not to. You want to give as much information as you can to your learner because you don't want to miss an opportunity to teach them and to help improve their performance, but overdoing it then can ultimately have a negative consequence. And so letting learners sort of learn on their own is an important feature of that process, right? And the challenge to all of you, again, I have your motor learning teacher hat on right now. The challenge to you is to find that optimum balance with all the stuff in this class, right? But the feedback is a big part of it. Don't give too much, but give just enough. How do you know? Hard to know. Schedules for fading feedback. And so fading feedback is an idea to, how much feedback, when we look at feedback in terms of how often should we provide it in terms of blocks of attempts, the general strategy is the more complex the task is, give feedback more often. So the more complex the task is, maybe every 2 to 3 trials. If it's a simple task, this guy's doing an overhead, doing some sort of squat. I don't know how complex that task necessarily is. Maybe every 10 attempts, maybe maybe more complex, maybe every 5, right? So general idea is, though, the more complex a task is, the more often you provide feedback. The simpler it is, the less often you provide feedback. So bandwidth feedback is a concept. It's a pretty cool idea, and I had students in your class in the face-to-face version who actually use this type of feedback in some of the sports that they coach and some of the things that they're coaching or do as clinicians. And bandwidth feedback is an idea where feedback is only provided when performance falls out of sort of a predetermined range. So you have your performers and they're learning their skill. And if they stay within a good range, you know that their practice is going to lead to improved performance, and they don't need feedback. But if they start to drift out of that range, then all of a sudden, hey, wait, something's happening. Your performance isn't where it is, your acquisition trials or whatever you're looking at, then the feedback is provided. And so this can be really effective for multiple reasons, right? You kind of, it's a sort of almost a performance-based model of knowing when to provide feedback. So you don't think you're not going to give too much, and you may give just enough. And so in terms of answering the question, how much should I give? When your performers are really sucking it up, you're going to be given more. When they're doing really well, they don't need it necessarily. So identifying that range can be a challenge. Research has been done out there. Is it 10 to 20% outside of perfect? Is it 30 to 40% outside of perfect? Not always easy to determine that. It depends on the level of the learner, it depends on the task itself, all those good things that you've come to basically accept as affecting decisions and concepts in this class. One of the best aspects of this is it is a sort of helps with motivation of the learner. Learners know, hey, if I keep performing well, the less feedback I get, the better I'm doing. And so they work, and it keeps them motivated to not receive feedback because they know they're performing well. And so, so there is sort of even that outside factor of improving the ultimate outcome. All right, that's it. Chapter 12 is in the books. The lectures for this class are in the books. Good luck on the rest of the class, your labs, and your exams, and